Podcast for podcasters by podcasters. Podcasting Smarter is the official podcast from Podbean, featuring podcasting interviews, best practices, and helpful tips. We're here to give you the tools, resources, product updates, and news to help you get started podcasting and keep your podcast growing.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our beautiful event today. I'm so excited to be joined by Dan from Focusrite. My name is Norma Jean Belenke. I'm the head of events here at Podbean. And today we're going to talk all about production, right? Production best practices, things to do to improve the production quality of your podcast, shortcuts, so much. So stay tuned. I'm going to read our brief intro and then we'll jump in and get started. Welcome back, everyone, to Podcasting Smarter and our January live event, 2024 Podcast Production Essentials, Unveil Pro Secrets with Dan Hewley of Focusrite, where we're talking about podcast production, best practices, tips, and how to set yourself up for success, whether you're a beginner or a pro. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Podcasting Smarter has live stream sessions like this one with top podcasters and industry experts. We also have exclusive recorded episodes on the Podcasting Smarter podcast, so make sure to check that out as well. Podcasting Smarter is brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to over 640,000 podcasts. To start your podcast, head over to podbean.com today. And now we'll jump in and get started. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Norma Jean.
So I'm so excited to talk to you about podcast production today because so many podcasters out there feel really intimidated. It's such a big thing, right? Where you think, oh, I don't know that much about audio. I don't know about, the nuts and bolts of recording, but I have something to say. So I'm so excited to sit down and chat with you today. And of course, for everybody out there, pop your questions here in the chat. And we also have email. So you can email us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. And first of all, I want to talk about, the evolution of podcast production because we're kind of living in the future. Welcome 2024, right? We're starting off with a lot of podcasting tools. And at Podbean, it's our big launch month here in January. So last week we had John coming on talking about Podbean Academy and a lot of the resources we have here. And then next week we have the Dear Alice podcast, which is an incredible interior design podcast. And they're sharing all about how they grew the show and monetized. So we're here for launch month. Launch month. Sorry, I just sang that, everyone. So first off, I want to talk about podcast production evolution. So how do you think podcast production has evolved in recent years? And where do you see it heading in the near future?
What a great time to be alive and be a podcaster. Thinking back to the beginning of podcasting when everything was manual to now when you can automate most parts of a podcast, including if you want to get an AI voice to speak for you, you can totally do that. So podcasting's to the point where you can do as much or as little as you want in the process. So what a great time to be a podcaster it is right now. And just in the last few years, we've seen huge advancements, especially in the AI realm for podcasting. And we're going to see it just coming fast and furious, I think, in the next couple of years too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think AI, when we all think about AI, we think the Jetsons, right? We think we're living in the future. Not like, hey, you're going to get transcripts for your podcast, or hey, you can get social captions automatically generated, or hey, this AI is going to remove filler words while you're editing. And there's a lot of integrations that are also really helpful as well. So I think as the podcasting industry evolves, there's a lot of really great tech that allows you to use one platform for editing. And then, for an example, you can push it out to Podbean automatically without a download, re-upload kind of situation. So I think as podcasting evolves, it's something where, we're seeing things become smoother for podcasters, right? We're seeing the process shrink down. And we're here to talk about kind of how you can make the most of that and how you can really use tools and use techniques to improve not only your podcast, but your podcasting experience. So tell us first about Focusrite a little bit, because you guys have some products that are made for podcasting and you guys have audio interfaces, which for everybody out there, let's talk first. What is that, right?
Sure. Audio interface is a box that sits on your desk and it has two main jobs. The first one is to amplify the signal coming from your microphone. So you talk into the microphone, little electronic vibration goes down that, just a little electronic signal gets into the mic preamp, and that boosts up the level. So it increases the sound. So it's loud enough for a computer to process, and then it converts that analog, because our voices are an analog device and so are our ears. So anything that comes out of our mouth or comes into our ears, that's an analog signal. So the mic pre makes it loud enough, and then there's a converter in there that converts that analog signal into a digital signal, which a computer can recognize. And the amazing part about technology these days is you can hear that right back immediately with almost no delay. So it seems like you're speaking and hearing yourself at the very same time, which is really cool without delays.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys have some amazing interfaces that really help improve the sound of people's podcasts and the way that the audio is being recorded. I mean, I want to come back to that. But first, I want to talk about kind of a basic setup for podcasters. So when we're talking about an audio interface, that's kind of the 2.0 or kind of medium mid-range that we're talking about. So the base setup, I think, for everybody would be a place to record and a mic, right?
Yeah, a mic like you have now, like a USB mic. That's a great stepping stone for new podcasters because it's a low cost to entry. You can get your proof of concept out there and make sure that podcasting is something you're going to stick with, because you don't want to invest a ton of money into your gear, even though the interfaces at Focusrite are quite affordable. You don't want to make a huge investment and then go, get all upset that, maybe podcasting wasn't for you. But everybody's starting this month. Podcasting is for you. Do it. Please get your story told. So yeah, get started with a USB mic. And I'm sure you're going to ask a question about this. Make sure it has an XLR output. And we'll get back to that, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely. So for everybody out there who's thinking, okay, I'm here, I have a podcast idea, or I'm about to launch, or I'm thinking about starting a podcast, right? In terms of base level, what you're going to want is a microphone that will plug into your computer and a program on your computer that you can record with. That is baseline. That's number one.
The cool thing is, sorry to interrupt you, but the cool thing is most computers have free software. So if you have a Mac, you have GarageBand for free, which is great for recording podcasts. If you have a PC, you have Audacity, which is free, and you can record your podcast. So there's no additional cost. You don't have to have Pro Tools, or you don't have to have Adobe Audition and all these things that cost money, or Hindenburg, which costs money. I have a cheat code for that we'll get to later for Hindenburg.
We'll get into that as well. Yeah, so that's kind of the baseline for everybody out there. Don't feel intimidated, number one, and know that the baseline, entry equipment that you need is your computer, the program to record on it, and a microphone. So that's kind of level 1, 1.0. 2.0, we're looking at audio interfaces, and we're going to get into a little bit more with that later. But in terms of a microphone, Dan, let's kind of step it back. You said you want to make sure you have an XLR. And first of all, right, you want to make sure your baseline, your microphone can plug into your computer. So that's where you want to make sure it has a USB, right? So it can go from the microphone directly to the computer. That's if you're doing on a budget, preliminary, pared down, whatever you're doing, that's the baseline minimum. And then from there, you're going to look at a microphone that can plug into an audio interface or that has an XLR. And an XLR is a cable that's kind of round. It's a little bit fatter than a USB. It's much bigger, and it's got like 3 prongs in there. So I think we can look on the back of my mic. I kind of am a little bit without a mic stand today, so we can see. Here we go on the back of my microphone. This is what it looks like here. That is an XLR plug.
No idea what XLR stands for. I have no idea. Bonus points to anybody out there who knows.
Anybody out there, if you know, pop it in the comments. You can do a quick Google. So in terms of microphones, I just also want to kind of break it down a little bit more. There are 2 kinds of microphones, right? There's condenser microphones and there's dynamic microphones. And condenser microphones are really microphones that are mostly made for music. So just really quickly, we'll tell you they record every single sound that they can possibly pick up to the maximum. So if there's a pin dropping 2 blocks away, it'll hear it. But dynamic microphones are really made for podcasting. And what they're good at is really catching what's directly in front of them. So if you're a podcaster, maybe you're recording on the field, or you're an independent podcaster, you don't have an at-home studio. Most podcasters don't, which we'll talk about in a bit. But it's something where you want to make sure you have a dynamic microphone so that it'll just pick up your voice. You'll sound clear, but it's not going to pick up a bunch of sounds that you have to edit out later or that feel too busy in your sound.
Yeah, exactly. There's really no need for a condenser mic in podcasting. Some people will argue there is, but you have to have a very treated room, and it has to be a studio environment. You don't need that extra sound capability of that. You just get a nice dynamic mic.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of dynamic mics that we love, there's a bunch at Podbean that we love and recommend. Currently, I'm using the MV7 by Shure, which is great. Rode makes a lot of really amazing mics. Sennheiser as well. What are your favorites?
For dynamics, I like the Shure SM7B. They also have the new SM7DB, which is kind of cool. It has a gain booster built in. And I like the Electro Voice RE20. All these numbers and initials, I always forget.
I love it. It's like so technical. And, it's something where as you progress in your podcasting journey, you're going to find what you really love, right? Don't feel like you bought one mic and that's kind of your thing, right? You can change mics. You can get additional mics. I think everybody who's been in podcasting for a while knows that that's really something that you can grow with and your podcast can grow with as well. And Dan, you mentioned something just kind of briefly that I want to go into, which was gain. So when podcasters, when we're talking about volume levels of recording, gain is a really popular term. And I'd love for you to kind of break down what is the difference between gain and volume.
Love it. Thank you. I love that question. Gain is an input term, and volume is an output term. If you you want to turn your microphone gain up enough so that it's not clipping, and clipping causes digital distortion, which you don't want. So basically, just make sure you get it as loud as possible without hitting 0 or going above 0 dB. And your recording software will show you where that recording level is. There's always a visual cue. On our interfaces at Focusrite, we actually have input metering on the front of them. You can see exactly where your gain is set and exactly where your voice is hitting that. So I know, looking down at mine right now, I'm in the orange, which is just where you want to be, not hitting the red. But if I was talking a lot louder, I would have to turn that gain down. And don't confuse gain with volume. So gain is one thing that you kind of set and forget. If your headphones aren't loud enough, don't adjust your gain, adjust the volume or the output knob. I know on Scarlett it says output. On Vocaster, it also says output. Sorry. So yeah, it's an output, but that's really your volume.
Yeah, absolutely. And gain is something where it's, like you said, volume is output and gain is input. So gain is really what is going to be absorbed sound-wise, right?
Right. It's how much that mic increases the amplitude. I didn't want to say volume because that's the output, but the amplitude is more of an input term. So it increases that so it's loud enough for the mic pre to speak to the converter and the converter to convert it properly.
Exactly. So you just want to make sure the gain's there to make sure that your microphone picks up what you want it to pick up, right? Yep. Is your voice going to be loud enough? If you're recording maybe outside, is it going to catch a little bit of that? Is it going to catch the nuance of your voice? Either too much or too little. You want to make sure that gain is right in terms of what is going into your microphone. And the volume, like you said, is what's going out of it. I love that example as well. And so in terms of ideal setup, right, we're looking at a microphone. We've set our favorites and we'll have them here in the comments for you guys. And if you've registered for this event, we always send you an email with the links to everything we mentioned because we don't want you to have to kind of do homework. We do it for you. So we'll send you an email with all of our recommendations and everything we've mentioned here today. But so starting out, you've got your microphone, you've got your recording software, your computer, and you've got hopefully an audio interface that's really kind of 2.0. It's where you're, looking at balancing those levels as well. And then when we're talking about advanced users, right, when we hit that 2.0 stage, you've got your audio interface. And from there, you can also plug in several microphones, right? Do you have one you can show us? Do you have
an interface or a mic?
An interface.
I do. I have a Vocaster 2, which I'm not using. I'm using a Scarlett right now, in case you're wondering. But Vocaster 2 on the back, you can see there's two of those. There they are over here. Those XLR inputs, those are there. So you can have two people on the same interface, which USB mics, you can't do that. You're limited to one. And it just makes it a lot easier in the editing process if you can have two microphones plugged in.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk about kind of best practices in terms of setting up and recording in a little bit, but making sure that everybody has their own mic is a really big one. So if you are recording in person and you can get a second mic, that's a really great addition to your podcast as well. And like we were saying, an audio interface really helps you control what you're recording and what sound you're able to actually capture, which is really huge as well. So when we're talking about more advanced, when people see setups of other podcasters, and, we can just say this, like, it's intimidating if you don't know what you're talking about, right? And that's really what we're here to talk about today. So if you're, thinking about starting a podcast, you started a podcast and you're like, oh, I don't know what my setup should be, but you're online and you're seeing, maybe clips of podcasts that have all this gear and everyone's, mic'd up and sitting on a couch and all of that. What are kind of the top advanced interview podcasts doing? Let's talk about that first. And then we could talk about kind of those podcasts that are more heavily edited and documentary style?
I really think that something like a Scarlett or a Vocaster or the equivalent from one of our competitors is all you really need. For podcasting, that's really all you need. If you need more inputs, just find an interface that has more inputs and more outputs. Like, you probably don't need a whole lot more outputs. Yeah. If you have a show, Focusrite definitely has, 2-channel, 4-channel, an 8-channel. And when I say channel, I mean that's the input channel. How many XLR mics you can plug in for those roundtable discussions or, a whole group of people sitting on a couch. But then, it's just a lot of the same thing. So it shouldn't be too intimidating, because if you know how to use one, you know how to use all 8 or 12 or 64 or however many. Don't have 64 people on your podcast. That sounds terrible. But I would not want to edit that podcast. But, however many inputs you have, you really just need to learn one of them, and then you know all of them. So don't let that intimidate you. Don't let these shows overwhelm you. Some people do use additional external mic preamps. That's great. That's one place that you could increase the audio quality of your show, but there can be arguments against that too, because how much does it really increase spoken word? So I'm a fan of just using an audio interface, really just a basic one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for everybody out there, a mic preamp, can you just kind of break that down a little bit? Because Dan's actually an audio engineer. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But every time you use a technical term, Dan, I'm going to ask you to explain it.
I'm trying so hard to not be nerdy, but I'm going to be. So I'm not going to apologize that much for it.
No, we love it. We're here to share your expertise and to really share best practices. So break it down for us.
Sure. A mic pre or microphone preamplifier is the full name, is in an audio interface. It's in your mic too. It's where you increase that gain. The gain is the input of the mic preamplifier that then hits the converter in the audio interface. So really it takes that analog signal coming out of your mouth, still in the analog realm, it makes it loud enough so it can then be converted to digital.
Yeah, absolutely. Next I want to talk about challenges in podcasting. So what are some common challenges that podcasters face in terms of audio quality? I'd love to talk about that, and then some best practices or solutions for those issues.
There's a few. Is just your room and having a noisy room. There's the trap of falling into podcast influencers and treating them as audio influencers, which are different things. And yeah, really just sounding your best is a tough thing for some people. Mic technique is a tough one. And I don't know, before we started recording, I was making sure my mic was in the right place. I'm sitting a different way in my room, so I'm feeling a little fish out of water right now.
What is proper mic placement? What would you recommend for the average person who's recording their podcast at home, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want to make sure it's face on. You want to make sure your P's don't pop, right? That's right. Where you have a p, right?
Yep. Yeah, the plosives. What I normally do is try to stay about a fist distance away, because that's a unit of measure most of us have, is put a fist between you and your mic like that. And I probably muffled the sound, but that's about where you want to stay. So get to know what that looks like and try to stay about there. And yes, like you said, you don't want to be head on for the capsule. I can see I have a bit of an angle on this one. And for those plosives, for those P's and those B's that really send that pop sound to the capsule of the microphone, a couple ways to get rid of that. Like a windscreen works. You and I both have a windscreen. Pop filter, which is just a piece of fabric. And all it's trying to do is break up that powerful sound, that air that's coming out of your mouth at that point. Another thing is to tape a pen or a pencil directly on the center of the capsule, because that will divert the air around that, and it'll break it up and it won't hit the capsule as hard. So there's all kinds of budget ways to get rid of it.
Oh, I love that. I love that tip as well. And you mean just right on the top of the microphone?
Yep. So there you go. I have a pen right here. So just like that across the microphone, across the capsule. And what it'll do is it'll make the air that comes out with the P's and the B's, and it'll divert it to the sides so it won't be as intense.
Oh, I love that. I think that's a really helpful tip for everybody out there. You don't have to go out and, buy an expensive equipment, right? There's always things you can do that'll help you improve your sound that are maybe technique versus gear. So yeah, that's always what we're looking for here at Podbean as well. And in terms of what you said, podcast influencers not being audio influencers, that's a big one, right? And
yeah,
most people who podcast have a friend who podcasts, right? Or know other podcasters. And, a lot of these kind of practices and the way people do things are kind of passed from one person to the next, maybe without a lot of thought. It's just like, oh, this is how I set my mic up, or this is how much I turn up my gain. You should just do it the same. Or your friends will say, oh, this is how I did it, right? And don't be afraid to ask. That's number one.
Yeah. Yeah, don't. I mean, zero disrespect to anybody. No disrespect to these high-level podcasters, but
No, not at all.
some of them are they put out blogs about their setup, and it's a common question. What are you using? When I talk to podcast influencers, that's a question a lot of them get. And they're great at telling stories. They're great at building an audience. They're not necessarily great at audio engineering. And I mean that with the most respect to all these people. But don't be afraid to question them and get another opinion on something, just to make sure that you're not doing too much. Don't do too much. Don't buy too many things just because a podcaster said so. Keep it basic. And if they recommend a piece of gear, go to that gear manufacturer and find out the best practices of how to use it. That'll be on their website. We all have tutorials on how to use our interfaces for podcasting. All of us brands do. So find the best way to use that piece of gear, and don't necessarily trust that audio influencer because they're a great storyteller. Yeah. They might not be a great audio engineer.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. I mean, you said a couple of things there that I really want to expand on. Number one is that a lot of people that have big followings, they may know what gear they're using, but they may also be working with people that are setting it up.
Right. Exactly.
So
yeah.
They may even have gear sponsored, but they don't know what settings everything's on. So that's number one. And number two, it is always super important and easy to overlook getting to know your gear, getting to know the ins and outs of your gear and how it works. And most of the time, I believe this is true. You don't need more equipment. You just really need to know how to maximize the usage of what you have. Right? Yes. After those 3 or 4 pieces of initial equipment, right? You have your microphone, and we're just talking about recording. We're going to expand on that in a little bit. You have your microphone, you have your audio interface, you have the program to record, you have your computer. After that, everything else is their accessories, sure, and technique. But it's knowing what your gear is capable of and educating yourself, which is a lot, right? It can be really intimidating. So don't be afraid. Like you said, reach out to the manufacturer, reach out to their websites, reach out to other audio engineers that have blogs, right? I mean, at Focusrite, you also do a lot of interaction with podcasters about what works. And of course, you can always email us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. And if you have a question for Dan, we'll forward it to him. Don't worry.
Yeah, please send your questions. I love talking to podcasters and helping podcasters. One thing that you just said, because one person sets their level to a certain place, they say, set it to 50% or something like that. That works for their voice. Yes. Their voice is different from your voice. So you can't even go for like the input or the gain settings. That's not something you can copy from someone else. You have to. Every voice is different. You and I have different intensities to our voices. So you have to set it for you, not for what some other person told you is good for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a really great point as well. And it's easy to kind of think that podcasting is formulaic because we see a lot of people's success. And sometimes audio quality can sound the same when you think, oh, it's all the same, but it's so nuanced. And so it's important to just figure out what works for you and to do that. So next I want to talk about the insights of Vocaster too, because at Focusrite, the company you're with, you guys made an audio interface specifically for podcasting. Most audio interfaces are for music. Let's be honest. They are because, music. But Vocaster too is specifically for podcasting. So can you tell us a little bit about what makes it stand out for podcasting purposes and really how podcasters can use audio interfaces specifically for the podcasting medium?
The Vocaster 2 was something that I fought for our company to make. And I'm very proud of the work that our team did on it. It's a great sounding product. You're probably going to ask, why am I using a Scarlett and not using my Vocaster? Because I'm doing audio production after work. So I'm not trying to switch my audio interface all day. So I love and believe in this product. I can't suggest it enough for most podcasts. But what we did is I went to a lot of events and talked to podcasters as a representative of Focusrite to try to find out what the pain points were and what the problems were and what the gear was being used. I found out overwhelmingly Scarlett was a very popular interface already. So that was awesome to hear that. So then after that, you hear things like, I have an SM7B or an RE20, which are notoriously gain hungry microphones. That means you have to turn the gain way up. And most audio interfaces, including Scarlett 3rd generation, which we're in the 4th generation now. So Vocaster has enough gain for any microphone, and so does Scarlett 4th generation. You don't need to have a gain booster of any kind, like a cloud lifter or a Fethead or anything like that. We've eliminated the need for that. And another thing is headphone outputs. Scarlett has one headphone output with 2 microphone inputs. I suggest everybody on the show have a pair of headphones so you can hear yourself and you can hear your guests, and you're not shouting because you're your own sound is muffled. Independent controls for both of those, so you can both have different headphone levels, so you can hear it to your comfort level. And then something cool, just because you're a storyteller, you're not an audio engineer. To that point, auto gain is a really cool feature. So you push the auto gain button, you talk into the microphone for about 10 seconds, you just watch the timer kind of time out, and it sets that ideal level for you. So you don't have to think about it. You just start your show with confidence, which is very beneficial. There is an enhance button, which is very helpful. It's kind of like the magic wand button for your photos. You push that button and there's 4 different presets that you can use, and just find the one that sounds best for your voice. For the more advanced people, you can adjust the compression, the EQ, and the filter that are behind the scenes. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. And then finally on the front, there's a mute button for each channel, which I wish I had right now because, if I have a can of water here I'd like to open, but I'm not going to because I don't have a mute button and I don't want that to show up on the recording. But I could be all slick if I had my Vocaster, hit the mute button, and no one would ever know that I opened up a can on the air. But now I'm just going to have to wait.
Or you can just open it. Now that you've said it, Dan, you're free to open it. No, but I think that's something that's really important, right? There's a lot of things that you don't realize you need when you're recording, but little things that help improve, right? Mm-hmm. Help improve your experience. So for everybody out there, you can always mute yourself. I think that that's a really, really great thing. And especially if you're interviewing a guest, and we're going to talk about, kind of audio quality tips and getting the most out of your recording next. But if you're in an interview, for instance, right? And let's say, I'm talking to Dan, but I'm about to sneeze, I can mute myself, right? And so that's something that really, of course you can always edit it out. And that's what's great about recording individually. You can always just mute yourself or remove that in post-production as well. But it's something where, having that auto gain is really helpful if you're worried about the gain quality of your podcast and what your microphone is absorbing, if you want to have that smooth sound. So next I want to talk about audio quality tips. So what are some things that podcasters can do to improve their audio quality regardless of budget? We spoke a little bit about mic techniques and mic placement, making sure also that, this is something that we haven't exactly talked about, but you want to make sure your microphone is at an angle. Yeah,
slightly at an angle. That helps too for the plosives as well. But yeah, just having good mic technique is one of the most important things. And then also as an audio engineer, when I first started, you buy all these plugins or tools that can change and modify the sound of your voice or your music or whatever you're recording. Just because you have all those tools doesn't mean you have to use any of those tools. Just because someone says you have to use a compressor on your voice, that's not 100% accurate. I generally don't do much processing at all on my podcast because I'm a firm believer of a clean signal going in or a clean sound being recorded into your computer should be all you need. I Fix It in Pre was a podcast that I was going to start with a friend of mine. Fix It in Post is something that people say all the time, but fix it in pre and then you don't have to worry about it later. So just make sure you're getting the best sound you can. And if you're not happy with it, try again. If you're upgrading from that USB mic to an audio interface, don't try your audio interface on an episode of your podcast. Do it for hours beforehand. You had mentioned get to know your gear, and that's something before you use it the first time, get to know your gear really well so you're comfortable. Just don't do too much. And if you don't sound good, find an audio mentor. Find someone who knows what they're talking about in podcasting and go with them. They might not necessarily be the most popular podcaster, but if they sound good, that's really what you're trying to achieve, is finding that good sound.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you've said in terms of that audio quality and playing with your gear, right? Experiment, get weird, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, as podcasters, there's already a level of weird, right? You're already here to be vulnerable and tell stories and put yourself out there in the world. So make sure that you experiment with your gear and that you know how all the settings work and you know what all the possibilities are so that when the time comes, you can just change the setting or know what's going to sound good when and where, I think is a really important aspect as well. And in terms of that audio quality, we kind of briefly touched on this earlier, but I want to talk about space.
Sure.
In terms of getting out there, right? So mics, especially dynamic mics, they're not going to pick up the sound of a pin dropping. They're going to pick up your voice, but your voice and the way that your voice sounds on the mic is going to sound different in different physical environments.
Yeah. So I'm in a room that's hilariously, I have carpet up to about my shoulder here. That's how the house came when I bought it. And it was funny. My realtor said, yeah, we could get rid of that, but no, it's perfect. There's sound absorption right there. So that works for me when I'm mixing. So I mix with speakers. So what happens is if you have flat surfaces behind you, the speakers will bounce off of that and come back and you'll hear the sound again. So there's a bit of reverb, or, which is, we've all heard reverb before, right?
Yeah, like an echo.
Yeah, an echo. It sounds like you're in a big church or a big auditorium or something. So that happens, and think about that. Like, you're constantly listening to music, that sound is just bouncing around your room. So minimal sound treatment is really great for recording. Make sure you're not sitting next to another person with a microphone. Sit across from them. It makes for a good conversation because you can make eye contact with the person, but also your microphones aren't going to be picking up the same sounds, which helps a little later in the editing process. And there's companies out there where they will help tune your room for you. So it's kind of cool technology.
That's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of plug in the measurements of your room online, and you can set a microphone kind of in the center of your room and let the microphone listen to your room, and it'll tell you where you need things. It's kind of a cool process. Again, like when I was in music school 12 years ago, this was all math and I had to figure it out myself. Now these kids got it so easy.
We're living in the future. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we'll have some links. We'll have some links here that kind of show you where you can do that. So crazy. And, I've had top podcasters tell me, I record under a blanket in my closet, right? To get that very intimate, soft sound, right?
Yep.
Of not having reverb or the sound of the room. They really want things to sound muffled. So you really only hear their voice, and it's intimate, and, you feel like you're there with them. And I think that that's a really important aspect of podcasting as well, because we talk about this all the time at Podbean. You're listening to a podcast on the same device you call your mom, right? You talk to your family, you talk to your kids. And so in terms of the sound, it's important to understand people are very rarely listening to your podcast through speakers. Yeah, people listen in the car, but people mostly listen on headphones, right? I think that's a really important aspect as well. So when you're thinking about the sound of your show and the sound of your room and the space around you, how do you want it to sound? And some of those tips, like we said, is making sure you have things in your room. We're going to have links to where you can plug your room in. That's crazy, Dan. But also, I've had podcasters say, specifically closets. Closets are a really big one. Putting blankets over your head are a really big one to just get a muffled sound. We've had like all sorts. I've had people tell me all sorts of stuff, in terms of where they record under tables, it's really crazy. So it's great to experiment and find out what works for your show. And you can also build it in, right? You can say, hi, everybody, I'm talking to you from under my blanket, and welcome. Yeah. Or you can not, because it doesn't fit into your show. But it's important to play around with your sound in that way as well. The industry is really emerging, right? Like we're living in the future. We keep talking about this. So what are some trends in podcast tech and the technology that podcasters are using to make and produce podcasts that you've found really exciting these days?
We've mentioned this whole time is AI, and it's in all aspects where it'll create your show notes, it'll create social posts for you, but there's also podcasts that are fully programmed by AI. Well, my favorite podcast is an AI driven podcast, which is really cool. It's called Dudesy, if you haven't heard of it, but Dudesy is a proprietary AI, and it follows these two guys' complete lives. So it has access to all of their personal information and creates the show around them. And every week it gets better. And it's a really hilarious podcast that I've learned so much about science and technology on a comedy podcast. But yeah, the AI is just going to make our lives easier. Like AutoGain, there's a little bit of AI in there. It's DSP, which is digital signal processors, which are inside of a lot of audio interfaces. Some have them, some don't. But yeah, that's basically an AI. It's a computer chip that's trained to help make your life easier. I just think there's going to be more and more of that coming, especially as AI is creating more AI. Which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And in December, we had a great event here at Podbean with James Cridlin from Pod News.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, where he shared all about AI tools to help you produce and revitalize your podcast in the new year. So now that we're here in the new year, you can use them. If you email us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com, we'll drop you a list of those tools. But I mean, even on the editing side, we're seeing some really cool things with Hindenburg and Descript, which are fantastic. I mean, Descript, you can select all the filler words and it will automatically delete them, right? And we have integrations with both of those editing platforms. So it's something where just know that, you don't have to download and re-upload. Once you've got the audio, there's so many cool things you can do.
Descript is so cool because it looks like a Word document and you just delete the words you don't want. It's kind of cool. And then Hindenburg, they have a really cool like noise cancellation or noise removal tool that I like to use. Some of the first episodes of the Focusrite Pro podcast that we did were on trade show floors. So imagine a convention center full of people just talking. It's just noise. And yeah, the AI tool there, it did a really good job of cutting out a lot of that background noise.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And Hindenburg also has an integration with Podbean, so you can literally directly publish from the backend into Podbean. And they have some really cool features of the platform. James actually goes into it. So we'll have the link to that event here in the show notes for today, or in the description if you're watching on YouTube. So you can rewatch. He does a bit of a screen share and kind of shares the back end of Hindenburg, which is a fantastic technology. And
Cool.
You guys at Focusrite, you also have a bit of a collab with Hindenburg as well.
Yeah, I alluded to the easy button or the simple way to get Hindenburg. If you buy a Vocaster, you get a 6-month license to Hindenburg Pro. And then after that, you have Hindenburg Lite for life. So, it's a value add. It's free. It's something we take care of once you register your Vocaster. We make sure that you have that industry standard for podcasting recording software.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what's one of the great things about podcasting is that we all just want you to make a great podcast as smooth and as simple as possible. So Hindenburg's a really fantastic interface. And like you said, with Descript, we also have an integration with them and their text editing. So if you don't want to learn how to edit sound waves, you can literally select the text you want to cut, chop it out of there. Like literally like you're editing a Word document. It's fabulous. So there are so many tools out there that really enable you to streamline your process. For us at Podbean, we want you to be able to make a podcast fast and efficiently and without any kind of fatigue. Because that can build up. And when you build something and when you start a podcast that you're really excited about, maintaining that excitement and momentum is paramount to keeping you continuing podcasting.
Yeah, I remember how excited I was every time I released an episode. I didn't care if anyone listened. It was just so fun to put it out there. Just because I was being creative and I was coming up with something from nothing, pretty much. So yeah, it was always really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for everyone out there, just know you want to make sure that you have your process as dialed in as possible. Yeah. And that's why we have this event here today, and this whole launch month here at Podbean, let alone all of our events, to really just help you dial in your process so that it's as seamless as possible and you reduce that fatigue, because so many podcasters start out with that excitement, episode 1, episode 5, episode 15. And, we talk to podcasters that are 500 episodes in. And the thing that makes the difference is really having a process and having it be as dialed in and as streamlined as possible. With the Vocaster and the audio interface that, you are really part of creating at Focusrite, which is so cool to help create a piece of hardware that people use for recording. Amazing.
Yeah.
It really, at Focusrite, you guys incorporate user feedback into development of new products and features. So what is some of the most common feedback you hear from podcasters?
First, I pushed the company to make it. It was my idea to make it. The team did an incredible job. But this goes into your question of a lot of user feedback was used in designing a Vocaster, both from what I did out in the field, talking to people, but then with our product team, interviewing podcasters, speaking to them, surveying them, finding out what they needed, and what the pain points were that, some I didn't find, some they found, some they just came up with really great innovations to put into the box, which is cool. And I think the biggest thing is just how can you simplify my life? And that's really what we put into Vocaster, was simplifying the life of a podcaster. Our company's mission is to remove barriers to creativity. And beyond that, we don't want technology to get in the way of you using technology. So we want to uncomplicate your life. And I think that's what they did. And that's for the next steps of Vocaster. I don't really know what those are. And I couldn't speak to them anyway, because they're a future roadmap thing. But we are still listening to podcasters, and we'll put that feedback in future products.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was some of that feedback? Like, what have been some common issues or roadblocks that podcasters have?
The gain setting issue. So we tackled that with putting auto gain. Auto gain, making themselves sound better. They don't know how to use EQ or compression. So we put 4 presets in there. So you can put on that magic wand button and you can select through 4 different presets to find how you sound the best. Removing of a gain booster. So you don't need to have the cloud lifter. So it's one piece of gear that you might not think to buy. So if you get an SM7B and an audio interface that doesn't have enough gain, you're going to think one of them's broken because it's not loud enough. So then you find out, you have to buy a gain booster. And then you're like, that's another $100. I just spent all this money. We got rid of that. Saved you $100. Saved you the headache of even thinking of that. If you want to record directly to a camera, this is something I haven't mentioned yet. There's a camera output on Vocaster, so you can record directly to a camera. If you want to take a phone call the old school way, like using your telephone, like your iPhone or your Android or whatever, there's a Bluetooth connection on Vocaster, and it records every person onto their own individual channel in your recording software. So later on, you can mix that. And then there's a wired connection. So you can plug in a phone or an iPad or anything that has an 1/8-inch plug. And, that's another way to take phone calls, or you could trigger sounds, or flip it around the other way. You can record out to your apps. If you want to go live on TikTok, you're sending your computer audio. You can pull in royalty-free music from Spotify or Apple Music. You can pull in YouTube clips and reply to them in real time without having to, recable things. So we tried to think of podcasting from a lot of different angles and a lot of different types of shows, and spoke to the people about that. Like, something called a mix minus. I'm not going to get into what that is because you don't need to know what it is. It's in the box and done. It's not something you have to think about. And if you know what that is, you know what a headache it is to achieve. But we did it electronically. Don't even have to think about it in the box.
Yeah, I think that that's fantastic. And for everybody out there who's thinking, oh, there's all these things I have to know, there's some things you have to know. And it's important to get familiar with the gear that you have, like we've talked about. But it's also really important to know that you're not going to know everything, right? I mean, Dan, you went to school, you went to college for audio engineering, right? Like it's 4 years of your life.
Yeah. There's a lot I don't know.
Yeah. So I think for everyone out there who feels like, oh, I have to know everything about audio, nobody knows everything. That's number one. We're really here to help you just learn what you need to learn, the baseline, right? And give you some ideas and some tools for getting started. So Dan, wrapping up today, what advice would you give to podcasters or people who are thinking about starting a podcast, aspiring podcasters, especially here for our launch month, who are just starting out and want to create high quality content?
So something I have written on my board over here is keep it simple. I'm a person who stacks things on top of things, and there's just too much going on. And I always have to remind myself to go back to basics and make sure that I'm doing the minimum possible to get that sound and get that good audio quality. And usually that's enough. It's when I overcomplicate things that things start sounding funky or weird, or if I try something that someone tells me to do, it might not be the best for me. So really keep it simple, get the best gear that you can afford, but also you don't have to go overboard on it. You don't have to get a $500-$600 audio interface. You can stay in the under $200 price range and you'll get something great. Microphones, that's a place you might want to spend a little bit more money because the microphones can be a bit more expensive. I think an SM7B is around $400, but there are plenty of options under that. One of my favorites that I didn't mention earlier is a Heil PR40. I think those come in right around $300, so they're a little bit cheaper, maybe $250. So yeah, just keep it simple, back to basics, and just tell your story. I want to hear it, so just tell it, please.
Oh, I love that. I think that that's very true. And there's also microphones that are like $100, right? They may not be,
yeah, of course.
It's something where don't feel like because you don't have the cash to shell out for a recommended microphone, because $400 is
that's a lot.
It's a lot, right? But you can always upgrade. And this is what we see with podcasters all the time. The podcasters that are, successful year after year, that are monetizing and living off their podcast, they all started somewhere,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so it's important to know that wherever you are starting is perfect.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. And you'll improve just by doing it.
Yep, it's your journey. Sorry to on the microphone thing. Yeah, the Shure SM58 is probably the most popular mic in the world. Anytime you go to see a concert, that's the mic everybody on stage is using. It's about $100. And it has some of the same components as the SM7B. It's just a different form factor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dan, it's just been such a pleasure. I mean, for everybody out there, like I mentioned, if you have questions, you can always reach out to us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. And if you have questions for Dan, email us there and we'll forward them. We'll forward them to Dan. And Dan, thanks so much for being part of our launch month. We had John last week.
Ooh,
and
John.
we've got, I know.
Got to give him a high five.
You got to give him a high five.
High five, John. Hopefully that was on the right side.
Done. Virtual high five. So yeah, it's been such a pleasure. Next week, we have the Dear Alice folks as well, talking about how they grew and monetized their podcast, which is a phenomenal podcast all about interior design. So the whole purpose of Launch Month is really to help give you the tools and the inspiration and the insight to get your podcast up and running, right? We have Podbean Academy, which really helps you break down any specific aspect of podcasting, whether it's publishing your podcast, learning how to monetize, all sorts. We've got Dan here and we're talking all about production, which has just been such a treat, Dan. Thank you. And then we're talking to the Dear Alice folks who've really lived it and have built their podcast with Alice Lane Home Design. So we're just so excited that you've joined us here for launch month. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. And thank you everyone for joining us at Podcasting Smarter for our January live event, 2024 Podcast Production Essentials. Unveil Pro Secrets with Dan Hewley of Focusrite, where we talked about podcast production best practices, tips, and how to set yourself up for success, whether you're a beginner or a pro. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Podcasting Smarter has live stream sessions like this one with top podcasters and industry experts. We also have exclusive recorded episodes on the Podcasting Smarter podcast, so make sure to check that out as well. And if you joined late or you want to have another listen to this conversation, you can replay this live stream on Podbean's YouTube channel, and we'll have it up on the Podcasting Smarter podcast. Podcasting Smarter and our event today are brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to over 640,000 podcasts. To start your podcast, head over to podbean.com today. And of course, if you have any questions, you can email us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for more podcasting tips and best practices in 2024. Happy podcasting, everybody. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Norma Jean.
Thanks for joining us for this replay of our live event episode. If you have any questions about podcasting and want to get in touch with the Podbean team, reach out to us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Happy podcasting.